clicker, but we're gonna have
That's right. Well, I see that.
I got 6 hour drive.
Oh, is there sound? Oh, is there sound?
Alright, sorry guys, we've had a little technical difficulty this morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
They can hear you, they're just not listening to you.
Can everybody hear me now?
No.
No. Can you hear me now?
No.
Okay. Had a little technical issue this morning, and so some people may come in at some point because our little clicker's not working. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So, we're going to start off with your annual board orientation and training. Yes. We will. All right, I will speak up. We will try to make this as painless as possible, but I know that a lot of these topics are boring, and I know that a lot of you have already heard much of this, but we do have some brand new board members who have not necessarily been made as familiar with some of these things as you all are. So we need to be respectful of our new board members and kind of go through the whole history. And before we start, if you look in your binders, one of the things we didn't mention last night was that we included a couple of documents on using people first language. I don't know if you all saw that. And Christina was at the Developmental Disability Council yesterday. Is that right? Yesterday. And they have some great brochures and handouts about people first and what people first language is all about. So I'm just going to pass those out. You guys can. Okay, so we're going to start off with something I'm calling right now the evolution of an LME MCO. Jenny Pugh helped me come up with that title. We were sitting around in a meeting and I said, I don't know what to call this, and so she came up with that. We're going to kind of go through the legislative history of LMEs in general and Smoky Mountain and Western Highland in particular. So the first thing I want to do is kind of start with the age-old philosophical question of what are we, who are we, and why are we here? And the why part is very easy. We're here because the statute says you have to be here. Everybody has to be trained. It's a requirement of the governing statute for LME area authority boards. It says that all members shall receive, so it's shall, it's not permissible, it's mandatory, initial orientation on board member responsibilities and annual training. And it has to cover a few topics, most of which fall in Lisa's area, which is why we made her come today and do some training for you guys on finance issues. And the statute also says that anybody who refuses to be trained is grounds for removal from the board. The more complicated question is, what are we? So I want this to be as participatory as possible. So I'm going to ask somebody to just shout out, what do you think we are?
Caring citizens.
I like that very much. Did everybody hear what Nancy said? Caring citizens who want to make things better. And I think that's a good description. Unfortunately, that's not how lawyers write statutes, so that's not what the statutes say. Anybody else have any ideas?
We are a large insurance company.
We are somewhat of a large, what kind of an insurance company though? Are we public or private?
We're private.
We are public. We still are a local political subdivision of the state of North Carolina. So we are part of local government, and that's an important thing to remember. There's been a lot of confusion since we started moving into the MCO side of things. Had at one point some folks in the federal government at the SAMHSA administration call us up at Alliance and say, you can't have that grant because you're not a public entity. And we said, what do you mean we're not a public entity? Well, you're an insurance company now. We said, no, we're still a public entity. Sent them the statute, and they said, no, we don't think the statute's good enough. We need a formal letter from the Attorney General. So we had to get a formal letter from the Attorney General that proved that we were still a public entity. So there's a lot of confusion out there, so I just want to make sure everybody realizes we are still a political subdivision of the state. And we are still an area authority. As Jay mentioned last night, all of those terms remain in the statute. They haven't gone away. So we are still an area mental health, developmental disabilities, and substance abuse authority as that term is defined in the statute. And what that means is, or at least what the statute says, is that we're the locus of coordination among public services for clients of our catchment area. So that kind of gets into our management function and our care coordination function and how we link people to services. We're also a local management entity. I've got a slide that tells us what that is. And we're also an LME MCO. So we are all of those things because all of those things are defined separately. And again, I know it's confusing, but it's because the statute hasn't been updated properly. And so all these terms remain in there. And so you kind of just have to realize that every time it says area authority, that still means us. Every time it says LME, that still means us. And when it says LME MCO, that still means us. So what is an LME? Does anybody know?
Local management entity.
Thank you, Vernon. So it's really a collective term. It doesn't have a definition. It refers to our governance, to our functional responsibilities rather than our governance structure. Area authority is the term that really refers to our governance structure, and LME is about our functional responsibilities. Brian pointed out that usually when people use the term LME and when they've used it historically, they're talking about the state-funded side of things, the DMH contract, all the pieces that we do for the Division of Mental Health. And what statute says is that we're responsible for the management and oversight of the public system of mental health, developmental disability, and substance abuse services at the community level. So it's a little different than being the locus of coordination, like on the previous slide, but pretty much the same. So it's another example of where they have both of these definitions in there. They're kind of the same, but not exactly. We just kind of have to figure out what that means. So what is an LME MCO? This is a brand new term. General Assembly created last session. Yes, last session. So it's a brand new term because everybody was using it already. And so they decided to go ahead and come up with a definition for it and codify it. And so an LME MCO is an LME that has a contract with DHHS to operate the waiver. Okay? And the reason you still have that two separate, there is still one LME in the state of North Carolina that exists as an LME and is not an LME MCO. Can anybody tell me who it is? Nope. Anybody know? Danny?
I would guess Kirk.
No, it's kind of unusual. Christina? Smallest LME.
I keep thinking of,
They never merged.
Oh, Cumberland.
Close?
Yeah.
Very close.
Yeah.
Johnston. Who said that? Was that Brian? Yay, Brian. So, Johnston LME never formally merged with Alliance. So they still exist as an LME, even though their population doesn't meet the threshold, because there was a little bit in the waiver language that said if you entered into an interlocal agreement with another LME to be the lead agency, that you could continue to exist. So Johnston LME continues to exist. Not sure how much longer DHHS is going to allow that to happen. Although, if any of you know Dr. Nutt, it could go on for a very long time. So, everybody know Dr. Nutt? That's her Nutt. That's her name. Janice Nutt. She's been the LME director in Johnston County for 20 plus years.
Related to Dr. Shaky?
Yes, exactly. So now that we kind of have those technical terms out of the way, we're going to have a little history lesson. And I apologize at the outset for those of you that you already know all this, but again, you have new board members who don't know all of this. So I'm going to go all the way back in time to, anybody can tell me what they think a very important date was in North Carolina history and mental health history.
It would have to do,
There's a little clue in the corner. That's right. When was Dorothea Dix Hospital founded? Anybody know when that hospital opened? Lisa's guessing 1889. Christina's guessing 1848. It is somewhere in the middle. 1856. That is the first state mental hospital in North Carolina. It was in Raleigh. It was later renamed Dorothea Dix Hospital. I'm sure most of you have been to the Dorothea Dix campus. I myself and Lanier have spent a great chunk of our lives on the Dorothea Dix campus. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of property. And then in 1880, Cherry Hospital was open. Does anybody know what Cherry was originally opened for and why they had to open a second mental hospital so quickly and why it was separate?
TV.
TV?
Tuberculosis.
No, no, this is, think about the history of the South and why things might have had to be separate. This was a segregated facility. This was the hospital for African Americans with a mental illness. 1883, Broughton Hospital in Morganton was opened. Christina tells a really wonderful story at orientation about her kind of growing up in Morganton and spending a lot of time in Broughton. So if you've never heard that story from Christina, I encourage you to ask her about it. It's very touching. In 1914, we had the first Center for the Developmentally Disabled, and that was the Caswell School. Can anyone guess? It did not have a people first name when it first opened. Can anybody guess what it was originally called? Christina's trying. I can see it.
There's a whole history there about
There
that
is.
institution.
There
It
is.
was just, today it would be considered horrible language, but I can't pull
It
up what it
is. It was originally called the North Carolina School for the Feeble-Minded. And it's interesting, though, they changed the name within 2 years, which tells you that even then, people did not like that name and had concerns with that name. In the 1930s, Charlotte and Winston-Salem established the state's first local mental health clinics, the sort of predecessors to area programs. They were the first ones in the state. 1947, the Butner Training School was opened, which became the Murdoch Developmental Center. And in 1963, the Western Carolina Center in Morganton, which was later renamed J. Iverson Building. And I think what's interesting about this history is that you see all the way up until 1963, it is all about institutions, right? There are no community-based services looking at this history, right? Everything is about institutionalization. So then we have a big change at the federal level. In 1963, as a result of work by President Kennedy, we had the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which authorized federal funding for the construction of community mental health clinics. And so North Carolina followed suit pretty much immediately in response to that legislation. And they set up funding to operate mental health clinics as a joint undertaking with state government. And that kind of was the standard until we get to mental health reform in 2001.
I mean, you could put an asterisk by that one. That was the
really the game changer right there.
Mhm.
The notion that money would be invested in communities, because you see, everything before that was about institutions, right? And what comes on the tail of that is the use of Medicaid funds to fuel the growth of services via the revenue for care. You know, if you go back kind of the old way of thinking about things, and this is what, you know, I lived through and Danny lived through, you know, community mental health centers at a county level. You know, originally that was whatever money the counties came up with, you know, to provide care for folks. And, you know, that was very limiting. It's like a kind of that grant-funded world. And whatever insurance, you know, depending if you're in a rural area and you had any insurance company, which probably be slim to none then. But then when Medicaid came in as a payer, and all you have to do is think about us now, our budget, the ratio is between 4 and 5 to 1 of state and county combined in Medicaid. So that's what a difference that made when Medicaid became the fuel to grow this whole system of care. It wouldn't have happened without that.
And that 2-for-1 ratio, Medicaid funds at approximately $2 to 1 local dollar.
So people were very, you know, they could realize that this was a great investment. You know, you can get all of this revenue from the federal government based on a relatively small amount of revenue from counties.
So the Community Mental Health Centers Act was extremely important. In North Carolina, we also had in 1977, the General Assembly finally said every county had to have some kind of program. They either could do it by themselves or they could establish it jointly with other counties to manage community-based mental health services. And then we get to mental health reform, and I'm going to get to that in a couple more slides. But that's kind of just a general history of mental health federally and at the state level. So as Brian said, and I stole this slide from Brian, so thank you, Brian. Area programs were kind of set up in the 70s to provide community mental health services. A lot of them were organized as single counties, but most of them were made up of small groups of counties, like Blue Ridge was originally and like Smoky Mountain was originally. They functioned a lot like county departments, and their predominant funding was state and county, and they wore two hats. Sorry about that. They directly delivered the services, and they contracted with other public and private agencies. And then Brian talked about how Medicaid reimbursement changed all that. And I know you guys have been seeing, thank you so much. And I know y'all have been seeing a lot of maps, but this map is different than the one you guys have been looking at for the past couple of meetings. Brian somehow got somebody at the state level to find this map.
Out of the archives.
It's a map from 1997 showing, I think, 39 different.
Was 39 the heyday? Christina or Lanier, remember?
42.
There was 40. I cannot make this work. Okay. Okay. It was 42, and I've got a little timeline that shows that I think by 1997 they've gotten down to 39. But you can see how many different ones there were throughout the state. We got Smoky over here, Blue Ridge, Foothills, New River, and Trend, Rutherford Polk. You'll see Foothills at that time included Burke, which it did not in 2007. So it's just kind of interesting to look. I will tell you all, Christina's laughing, but I have had a lot of fun this past week, researching all of this history. It's really been interesting to kind of look into it, and I think it's important that we do it because somebody needs to maintain it or it's just going to be lost. So then we get to mental health reform. 2001. And mental health reform, the most the biggest change, the biggest thing that it did was it separated the management and delivery of the services. And the area programs became LMEs. That's when the LME term first came into existence in the statute. So up until that time, LMEs, or area programs, had been direct providers of the services, right? You employed licensed clinical social workers, and psychiatrists, and other people to directly deliver the services. People came to the area program, to the mental health center to get services. Mental health reform required all the LMEs to divest. Everybody remember divestiture? What a fun time that was for everyone in the state. Anybody know who was the last LME to divest and when they did it?
We were towards the end, but I don't think we were last.
You were not last.
No.
You know who was last? Anybody? That would be Wake County, who finally divested last year. I got to be a part of that divestiture. They resisted it until the bitter end, and they only did it because CMS said that if they wanted to have members on the Alliance board, they could no longer deliver services, period, the end. And so Wake County was forced to divest last year.
Let me give you a little context here for Smokey, and especially because Duncan is here. Smokey for a long time held on to what I would say the core clinical kind of medical core services, that being psychiatry, mobile crisis, and then the facility-based crisis, and a lot of some amount of outpatient care. And we did an RFP, and that was right after I came, so 4.5 years ago. And Appalachian, which is a company that Duncan is the owner of, won that RFP. Okay, so that was our major house cleaning, if you will, around divestment. And Appalachian, went on to be kind of that comprehensive provider. And that's a term we'll talk, more and more about as we have time in our 7 western counties. So I'm trying to think, that's kind of an interesting story. They're really an outlier, but by and large, most of this divestment was done 5 years ago, we'll say. Again, the whole idea, you have to separate the role of payer and provider. And of course, now the world we live in has got all kinds of laws about that. We got contracts and laws because of, the potential for there to be any kind of abuse.
If I just add a little context, this has always been kind of interesting. The reason they wanted divestiture is you had, at that time, I guess still 30-some area programs. And some, like Smokey and others, are doing a very good job of providing services. Some were doing a poor job, and since all the services were basically internal referrals, if they were doing a poor job, there was no competition or anyone out there to do a better job. And so the reason for divestiture was to get rid of the monopoly, and it's one of those deals when you do the baby out of the bathwater. Those that were doing a great job had to divest just like those that were doing a poor job. And divestiture was probably the biggest problem with the reform, because the then LMEs were divesting, and not always at a time that other services were there to pick up the ball. And there was a provision in the law that the secretary could allow the LME to continue providing services if no other services were available. And I was deputy secretary then, and I don't know of any LME that requested to do that. And so they were divesting, and nobody was requesting to continue, although some, I think, did. But some of the problem could have been helped if we tried to create a bridge. And that bridge had occurred in a lot of it. And that's where we really started running into problems with lack of service, et cetera. Places like Smokey did a good job of keeping it all together. But there were other areas that really became a problem. And I remember I called lots of help because of Trend. Because Trend was divesting, and we were having some issues there, as well as across the state. So that was the reason we took that step. And I was out of the legislature then, so I was in the department, that the reason they took the step of divestiture was to try to create a system where you didn't have to kind of a monopoly of services.
Here's another little unique feature about Smokey and the context for us. You mentioned area programs really had the choice of going and becoming an LME. Again, being a planner, thinking about a future role as a payer, or a service provider. And that's really what New River did. And they used a piece of the law, 160A, that in kind of a unique way, really that law is intended to allow a group of counties to do what any single county can do. They used that to form an agency that was New River. And they said, look, we want to stay as a service provider. Smokey, you can go and do the LME part for us, but we're going to stay as a service provider. Now that didn't have a fortunate outcome some years later, but that was just another twist in how that major transition occurred. And I don't know, were there other 160As in the state that did that kind of deal? I don't think, not at the level of New River.
I don't remember.
There
So-
were some, but again, I don't remember the others. You're right, they weren't at that level. The other big thing that mental health reform did was the legislation required consolidation from 39 LMEs down to 20 by January 1st, 2007. Does that sound familiar? And it's interesting because January 1st, 2007, we'll see on the later slide, is the date that New River decided to become a service provider, and Smokey took over the management of those counties. It also added in the requirement of the local business plan, and this was put in there specifically to give counties more of a voice in how services were allocated and funding for services was allocated. And also, this is a big one, Pat and Judy and Nancy, it created the Consumer and Family Advisory Committees. So this was a huge step forward. It's one of the very positive things that came out of mental health reform. It also expanded the types of permissible governance structures, but I don't think that's important anymore because most of those governance structures have now gone away. And then there was a lot of criticism, separate and apart, from the divestiture. Does everybody remember community support? For some of the newer board members, you don't have. I know you remember community support. But Carolyn and Dr. had community support services were a particular mental health service. It was one of the first big services that the private providers were rolling out after divestiture. It had an extremely high rate. What was it, like $60 an hour? It had a $60 an hour rate, and it could be performed by a fairly low-skill individual. And so they're just, can't put lipstick on a peg. There was a lot of fraud. There was a lot of abuse of community support services. The state estimated at one point that $400 million was wasted on community support services. I don't know if that's accurate or not. And you're saying higher. I do know that I spent, I think, probably a good 2 years of my life doing nothing but community support recoupments. The LMEs actually got dragged into it and had to go out and do monitoring because the state didn't have enough staff to do it on their own. And so the LMEs were sent out to do monitoring. And that's actually how I first started to really meet a lot of the LME folks because I had to bring them to Raleigh to come be witnesses in community support cases. So it was a very tumultuous time, I think is a good way to put it. There were also some concerns about cherry picking, that the private providers were picking, again, community support, the most profitable services and not delivering some of the other needed services. And I thought this was interesting. I didn't know this until I was doing all this research. There's actually a Wikipedia page devoted to mental health reform in North Carolina. So for anybody who wants, it's not bad. Wikipedia is voluntary editing. I don't know who does it, but it's fairly accurate. So it's got its own page. So we talked about consolidation, getting down from 39 to 20. The General Assembly still wanted further consolidation, so how did they do that? They did that through population threshold requirements. So by July 1st of 2007, you had to have a minimum population of 200,000 or 6 counties, and you would face a 10% reduction in your administrative funding every year. By July 1st of 2012, you had to have a minimum population of 300,000, where they were going to, quote, reduce your administrative funding to a rate consistent with that population, and Lisa would have to explain what that means because I can't. And then by July 1st of 2013, you had to have a minimum population of 500,000. And that was actually the precipitating factor. Cumberland was the other LME that Brian mentioned that had not actually merged. And they merged with Alliance because they no longer met the 500,000 minimum population. So it had the desired effect. So now I want to talk a little bit about Smoky Mountain history, and I want to thank Lisa for giving me all these dates. I had to find somebody in the agency who'd been there long enough and could remember all of this stuff. So Smoky Mountain was created in 1972 in July. It was originally called the Smoky Mountain Area Mental Health, Mental Retardation, and Substance Abuse Authority, and it covered Cherokee, Clay, Graham, Haywood, Jackson, Macon, and Swain counties. And it stayed as Smoky Mountain in those 7 counties from 1972 until 2007, when it expanded into Allegheny, Ashe, Avery, Caldwell, and Wilkes for the New River counties. And then a year later, it merged with Foothills, which at that time consisted of Alexander, Caldwell, and McDowell counties. I thought it was important that we also look at Western Highlands District. And I had to dig a little deeper to get that. So really, they're not here, but I want to thank Donald Bruce, and Sonia Eldridge, and Darcy, who helped me track down this information. And actually, we got on the phone with Larry Thompson. I don't know any of the Western Highlands people remember Larry Thompson. He was the director of Blue Ridge, I believe, for many years. And he helped us clarify these dates. This was the best of his recollection on Rutherford Polk. We left a message for Fred Perrine at Rutherford Hospital, but we didn't hear back from him. We were trying to nail down when Rutherford Polk started, but it was sometime in the mid-70s. And Larry believes the trend started in 1978. And trend, kind of a cool name for Transylvania and Henderson counties. And so Blue Ridge, Rutherford Polk, and Trend began their dissolution in 2001 in preparation for the creation of Western Highlands. And the dissolution was completed in 2004. And Western Highlands started operation January 1st of 2004. I don't know if anybody noticed it last night when we were doing introductions and Vince Newton was here from the division. And Vince mentioned to me that he was present at the last board meeting of Blue Ridge, the first board meeting of Western Highlands, and now the first board meeting of this consolidated area authority. He thought that was kind of neat. So the next big step in mental health history in North Carolina is the big managed care pilot. And I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on that, and the expert is sitting right here, so please feel free to jump in. So April 1st, 2005, North Carolina launched a pilot program for behavioral health managed care under a combined 1915 BC Medicaid waiver, which I will explain to you all what that term means in a couple of slides. And Piedmont Behavioral Health LME was selected for this pilot program, and that was in Cabarrus, Davidson, Rowan, Stanley, and Union counties, the original 5 PBH counties. And it was a success. Access to care and member satisfaction increased, outpatient services stabilized, unnecessary hospitalization decreased, savings were reinvested, and from the point of view of the General Assembly, the most important factor was that there were stable and predictable Medicaid expenditures in contrast to the rest of the state. Everywhere else in the state, mental health was exploding off the charts, right? And you had stable costs in those 5 counties. So the General Assembly mandated expansion of the waiver program statewide by July 1st of 2013. And they actually, in 2010, said we want to go with 2 additional sites. And then they liked it so much, they said, let's just expand it statewide. So there were 2 RFAs that were issued, one in 2010 and one in 2011. And LMEs were required to apply and meet readiness standards, or they had to merge with other LMEs. So that forced further consolidation. Partners is a good example of that. Partners, they weren't able to can't even remember which three, it was Crossroads, Pathways, and
Mental health partners.
Mental Health Partners, decided that they were not going to be able to meet the readiness standards by themselves and needed to join together to submit an RFA proposal together. Another example of that would be Durham and Wake. Wake County actually tried very hard to meet the readiness standards and were unable to do so, and so they ended up merging with Durham County to become Alliance. So the timeline for waiver expansion, first, PBH expanded into Alamance-Caswell in October of 2011, then into 5 County, and then into Orange Person Chatham. Western Highlands Network was the first LME to go live after PBH in January of 2012. ECBH in April, Smoky in July. Sandhills went live in October of 2012 without Guilford County. Guilford County was added to them in April of 2013. For those of you who are paying attention, Guilford was kind of dancing with every LME and trying to get the best deal they possibly could before they decided who they were going to marry up with. Then East Point in January, Alliance, Centerpoint, and Partners in February. All three of them were supposed to go live in January, and Mercer said they weren't ready yet. Coastal Care in March, and MechLink in April. And Coastal Care and MechLink almost didn't get to go forward at all. MechLink, in fact, was notified that they would not be going forward, and then they, I believe, filed an
Somebody
appeal.
changed their mind.
Yeah, something happened there. And so MechLink was allowed to go live, which in retrospect maybe was not the best decision since they have not been successful. So recent legislative developments, because what I like to say is the General Assembly just loves us so much and they just cannot leave mental health alone. I have yet to see a session where they just leave us alone at all. So these are some of the recent legislative developments. We have Senate Bill 191, Senate Bill 208, Senate Bill 553, and Medicaid reform, and I'm going to talk about each one of those. So Senate Bill 191 is the one that Ronnie hates the most in all the world, and this is the bill on LME governance.
Master Dollar told me never to mention it again in my life.
That's a true story. And another true story is that I was the unfortunate AG assigned to sit in all of those meetings where they negotiated the LME governance bill, and boy, was that a lot of fun. It reduced the maximum size to 21 members, which obviously had the biggest impact on Smoky and ECBH because of the large geographic size of the catchment area. I will say I think the General Assembly had very good and valid reasons why they wanted to do that in terms of trying to get a professional board. They said you had to reside in the LME catchment area, which I don't know that there were any LMEs that had board members who didn't, but I think it was good to go ahead and codify that and make sure that it represents the local community.
I know somebody had asked me about that. It might have been Dr. Hack when we were talking about the insurance representative.
Yeah.
So,
And statute says they have to reside here. It's silent on the appointment process. It says it must ensure county participation. And then they just leave that up to us to figure out how to do. So that's not really very helpful. Although I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to Michael Lavender for what he managed to pull together. I believe he and Shelley spent a lot of time last year pulling together some proposed board that has been approved by the majority of our counties. So that was very impressive, especially given the lack of guidance from the General Assembly. It increased the term limit from 2 to 3, so you can now serve 3 terms. And Jay and I talked about this, and we believe that this is a brand new board. So even if you, for example, are Ed, and Ed, would this be your 3rd term? It is now your 1st term, because we're a brand new board. Everybody's starting over with their 1st term with this board.
You can't leave.
That's right. We came up with that interpretation on purpose, so we don't lose Ed.
That's fine, never go back to sit back.
It has very specific board composition. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. And then it also allowed for an alternate board structure if the LME meets 1 1/4 million population threshold.
Which is going away. It's a short session. That will be just, you will not say that this time next year.
Well, it's interesting because when the first session, because it's in two different session laws. The first session, it said you had to have unanimous approval from every county, okay? And the only LME that achieved that was Alliance. And I got to be a part of that, and that was one of the hardest political feats I have ever seen in my life. And Cardinal was unable to do it. And so what happened was the next session, they got the word unanimous taken out so they could go back and try again, and then they were able to do it. Because unanimous, that means literally every single county commissioner in every single county has to agree on your alternate board structure. I give full props to Ellen Holman for being able to achieve that. That was something else. So I think it's fair to say, if you look at this governance, that it had a diminished county role and greater professional involvement. And that's not my phrase, that's actually Mark Botts's phrase, and I think that's a very good way of looking at it. So the next bill we're going to talk about is Senate Bill 208, and this one was technically called Effective Waiver Operations. We all called it the red flag bill. And this bill, it's interesting because I think some of the public thought that this bill was intended to sort of slap down the LMEs and, put some benchmarks on them, and that was really not the intent of this bill. The intent of this bill was to ensure that the Secretary and DHHS were doing the monitoring that the General Assembly felt they needed to do. So this bill was really much more directed at DHHS than it was directed at us. Would you think that's fair?
Yeah, the other name for it, Danny, was, pretty involved from the council perspective on the development of this bill. Tommy Tucker referred to it as the Christmas tree bill, because it started off, just as Tracy said, it was, I think, an extension of the General Assembly's opinion that DHHS really was not acting as strongly as they needed to around the monitoring of the waiver development. And then kind of more and more kind of got added to the bill.
Yep. And so what it says is that DHHS has to have a certification to the General Assembly every 6 months. I think Cardinal only has to do it every year, because once you've been in operations for 2 years, you get to go down to a year or something like that. I have to go back and look at it. But they have to do a certification that the LME MCO has adequate provision against the risk of insolvency, and that's defined as an asset to ratio. Is that right, Lisa, an asset to ratio? Asset to liability ratio.
I was reading something.
That's what, an asset to liability ratio is how they're measuring that. You have to make timely provider payments, and that's because at that particular time, providers were all over the General Assembly complaining that they weren't getting paid. And you have to have adequate exchange of information. And this is some complicated HIPAA transaction set stuff that I don't pretend to understand. So what's interesting is that it's not really proving to achieve what the General Assembly intended, because these certifications are very much I think the best way to put it is a rubber stamp. They're not really, the vendors that they have hired to do these monitorings don't really seem to know a whole lot about managed care, and don't really seem to have the tools to actually do the level of monitoring that I think the General Assembly intended.
Notwithstanding that, are there LVMCOs that are failing
No.
the system at all?
Not on these benchmarks. All the LME MCOs were like at 99%.
But I think that the good question, and I think the answer in reality is that there's a wide variation in confidence from those like Smoky and a couple of others that are highly confident and gaining fast in terms of their sophistication, where there are others that are much more marginal, and that's not reflected in these reviews.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think MechLink is a good example of that.
On which side?
on the financial piece, on the asset to liability ratio. And this is all public. You know, MechLink announced at county commissioner meetings how they were manipulating the county dollars to meet that asset to liability ratio. They announced it publicly. So it was very clear that that benchmark was simply not achieving what it was intended to achieve.
Yeah, you know, they were, I think everybody recognized they were losing large, you know, tens of thousands of dollars every month
Yes.
with no path towards recovery.
So what the session law says, what Senate Bill 208 says, is that if the LME fails to meet those benchmarks, the DHHS must reassign the waiver functions. And they have to oversee the dissolution of the non-compliant LME. And what that means is that if the assets are, quote, insufficient, DHHS is responsible for the liabilities. DHHS also has to guarantee 15% operational reserves. So as you can see, they have a built-in incentive not to find any LME MCO to be non-compliant. I think we'll talk about that some more when we get to some more stuff about Western. And we could spend hours talking about who is actually going to hold the liability if and when something horrible happened. But we're not going to spend hours doing that here today. All I'll say is that as my friend Curtis Venable says, for those of you who know Curtis, this is what you call a lawyer's full employment act. So we will be arguing about it for a long time. He's going to kill me because that's on video, but that's okay. So the next couple of pieces that were in Senate Bill 208, it created the County Commissioner Advisory Board, which we talked quite a bit about last night. It is the Chief Advisory Board, we mentioned that, but I don't think we mentioned what it's the Chief Advisory Board for. What the statute says is that it is the Chief Advisory Board for service delivery. So this kind of gets back to that whole idea of the local business plan and counties having a say in how services are planned and allocated. It has to meet on a regular basis and can only have one member per county. Another piece in Senate Bill 208 is a standard contract for all LME MCOs. I actually pushed for that myself, got that in there, but we still don't all have the same contract. So we hope to one day all have the same contract, but we're not there yet. It also eliminated the county program option, which seems like a small thing, except what it did was it said, MechLink, you no longer get to be in this game. You're either going to have to spend a lot of money separating yourself from the county and creating an LME, or you're going to have to merge with another entity. It took away the county program option. And Mecklenburg fought really hard and just did not win. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Western Highland termination and the merger with Smoky, and that's not really to bring up hard feelings or upset anyone, but we have new members and everybody needs to kind of know the timeline and how it fits into the overall scheme. So on April 5th, 2013, the department sent a notice of termination to Western Highlands of their contract, and this is the interesting part, and I'm sure Chuck remembers this very well. The notice said it was without cause. And I think that sent a little shockwave through all the other LMEs that DHHS would choose to terminate a contract, at least on paper, without cause. The effective date was supposed to be July 31. That was not really very realistic, and it was extended through September 30th. On April 25th, the Western Highland Board voted unanimously to move forward with Smoky. May 24th, we entered into the management agreement between the two LMEs. September 30th was the last day. You really shouldn't say for providers to submit claims to Western Highlands. It's sort of the last day that they could deliver services under their Western Highlands contracts. They actually have several months after that to submit claims. And then January 23rd, as we all know, of this year was the formal approval of the dissolution and the consolidated 23-county catchment area. So this is what we look like now. Y'all tired of this map yet? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then we get to what I like to call surprise! Medicaid reform. So we're all trucking along thinking that everything is going really well. LMEs have gone live, and we're going to get some predictability in mental health, because mental health, we've got to have a major change at least every 18 months. And so that's kind of where we were. And then lo and behold, the governor and the secretary announced the partnership for a healthy North Carolina. These are the stated goals for the partnership: to create a predictable and sustainable Medicaid program for North Carolina taxpayers. Doesn't say anything about Medicaid beneficiaries, but that's okay. Increase administrative ease and efficiency. Provide care for the whole person by integration. So the General Assembly responded fairly quickly to this plan. There was a lot of, I'm not even sure the right word to describe it.
Anxiety.
Anxiety, shockwaves through government. Every provider organization in the state was, down at the General Assembly. You remember the secretary went around the state and had those town hall meetings, and they were packed. And there was a lot of opposition to the plan. I think that's a fair way of putting it.
Yeah, hang on a second. I mean, just, if you step back and think about this, you had new governor, new secretary, new Medicaid director, okay, clean slate. You had, a General Assembly in a past administration that had committed, through a lot of trials and tribulations, to public management. And this whole, you saw, 10 years, millions of dollars, tremendous effort on behalf of organizations like Smokey and all the other LMEs across the state to climb this mountain and kind of get to this place where the whole state now was operating under the 1915 DC waiver. And in one day, with a slideshow there were about 10 slides in the deck, it just portended to change all of that. And nobody was prepared for that message. And it's going to go down in North Carolina history, that date and that announcement. And in large part, that is what, most of the afternoon we're going to be talking about. It changed the course probably forever. When really turns around.
And I'm trying to stay kind of away from this topic, because I know that's going to be a big part of what Lanier and Dan are going to talk about this afternoon, but just wanted to say, so the General Assembly responded pretty quickly and kind of put the brakes, because DHHS was making some public pronouncements about how they could just move forward regardless of what the General Assembly thought. It was kind of the message they were sending. And so the General Assembly said, no, we don't think so. We're going to set up an advisory panel, and you have to work with the advisory panel, and you have to submit a report no later than March 17th, which coincidentally is my birthday. I'm really excited about that birthday present. And DHHS was allowed to submit draft documents to CMS and get feedback, but they were specifically prohibited in the budget bill from implementing a plan without legislation.
Is that St. Patrick's Day?
It is St. Patrick's Day.
I thought it was.
It's a great birthday.
What do you do on March 7th?
I get free drinks wherever I go.
So who's on the advisory panel?
I'm just getting ready to mention that. The advisory panel has Moses Cone Health System CEO Dennis Berry, Carolinas Medical Center's Chief of Staff Dr. Richard Gilbert, Peggy Terhune, who many of you may know is the CEO of Monarch, which is a behavioral health service provider, and then 2 legislative members, Representative Nelson Dollar, who is extremely invested in Health and Human Services, and Senator Lewis Payne. There have been 2 meetings so far, one December 5th, the other January 15th. The next meeting is on February 26th, and we actually do anticipate that they are going to announce their plan early. They're going to beat the March 17th deadline and announce their plan on, I think that's Tuesday, February 26th, so that's next week, so we should be getting more details very, very soon. I'm not going to go into it too much because I'm going to run out of time, but the General Assembly also gave them very specific list of things that had to be in this plan. So there's a lot of T's that have to be crossed and I's dotted. And then I thought I'd put together a little thing to kind of show you how things have changed. So from 1963 to 2001, there was the creation of 43 area programs that only went down to 39 in that entire time frame. In 2001, they were told they had to reduce from 39 to 20. By April 2013, we were down to 11 LME MCOs. By October 2013, we were down to 10 LME MCOs. By April of next year, we will be down to 9 because MechLink's contract ends March 31 and Cardinal is taking over that county. And then, as we've been discussing, and we'll discuss this afternoon, we don't know what the future holds, but it needs to hold 4. And that's what the map potentially would look like if we go to 4. It's a lot of blue. It's a big catchment area.
Only 35 counties out of 100 in the state.
A little more than a third.
Are those divided, does it come out population-wise that a lot of, each one of those has similar?
Comes out similar population-wise. It does not, however, match up to the physical health regions that DHHS has been talking about. So, again, I think Lanier and Dan can talk about that some more.
Wasn't there something, if I'm forgetting, I was thinking there was a caveat that said that the counties had to be contiguous.
What it said was you had to be contiguous unless you were already not contiguous. And that was the Cardinal. That's the Cardinal provision, because they weren't contiguous.
See, that was already the deal, okay? The only thing that gets added in for Cardinal is Mecklenburg.
Yeah.
Because they had the original footprint that cut across there. They weren't gonna redo that just to satisfy, to make the map look neater, so to speak.
All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little because I still have a lot of slides to cover. And now we're going to talk about board governance, which is just so exciting. I'll try and make it as not boring as I possibly can. So, everything that I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes pretty much comes from Chapter 122C, which is our little kind of Bible for LMEs. Every year I make myself a notebook with updated stuff, and it has my map. I have all the recent session laws. I have the CFR I need, and I have 122C, and I pretty much take it with me wherever I go. So what it says is that the governing unit of the area authority is the area board. All powers, duties, functions, rights, privileges, or immunities conferred on the area authority may be exercised by the board. We'll get the unpleasant stuff out of the way first. Board attendance. This was something that was in Senate Bill 208. Said that the board may declare vacant the office of a board member who doesn't attend 3 consecutive scheduled meetings without justifiable excuse. And we've got that in our bylaws, kind of modified it a little bit, and to try and make it a little more reasonable for this catchment area. And we have added in the telephone conferencing ability. One thing we are asking, and I'll mention this, is that we notify, if anybody's going to be out for a planned absence. Obviously, you can't predict when you're going to be sick or when a family member is going to be sick or unfortunate things. But if you have a planned absence, if you could let Jill know 48 hours in advance, it just helps us plan for a quorum. We have to have 13 voting members to have a quorum. And if we're not going to have a quorum, not a lot of point in meeting. And also we need to work on trying to get a quorum. So if everybody could let Jill know in advance if you're not going to be able to attend.
Tracy, this question was asked in Raleigh week before last about this.
Mm-hmm.
And the Institute of Government had a different take on it. If I send Jill my proxy vote, does that count as part, first of all, does it count that you do have a quorum if you have the proxy vote?
Yes.
That was the first question.
Answer is
The
yes.
second question was, if you have a proxy vote, but the person's not in attendance, does he fall under the 3 consecutive rule?
You know, I'm not sure, Jay, that we addressed that specifically in the bylaws, so that might be something we make a note of and go back. I mean, what is?
They said as long as the vote was there, that counted as a quorum, number one.
Yes, I agree with that.
So if it counts as a quorum, then you were there.
And it seems like you were there. Again, we didn't go into that.
But they didn't say
level.
that. They went into legalese and I lost track.
I got you. We didn't really go into that level of detail, so I think we need to just make a note, and that's something we'll go back and clarify in the bylaws.
That kind of violates the spirit of the law, though.
It does.
It does, because the intent was that people are there and that they know the business of the board and they know what's going on.
You could theoretically have someone that
Keep in
sticks
mind it
out
says
for
May.
3 years.
Oh, yeah.
They
Yeah.
kept using the word engaged.
Yes, you want an engaged board, yes. And it does, and Lanier just pointed this out, it does say may, it does not say we have to declare vacant. But again, we'll talk about this in the code of ethics later. One of the pieces of your code of ethics is regular attendance. You know, we're very excited to have you on our board. We hope you're excited to be on the board, and we hope that excitement translates into being here.
If you live in Buncombe County, you're not allowed to miss true.
Okay, that's the Ronnie Beal rule. If everybody heard that, if you live in Buncombe County, you are not allowed to miss a meeting, period. So, the board responsibilities, the functions, powers, and duties are spelled out in Chapter 122C. And Jay mentioned this last night, what we tried to do in the bylaws was kind of separate the direct responsibilities of the board, which are not, not extensive, but you do have some direct responsibilities that belong to you, as opposed to the administrative responsibilities of the LME that the board oversees. So the direct responsibilities, and this is the biggest one, it's the first one that's discussed in the statute, is to approve the planning and budgeting of publicly funded community-based MHIDD-SA services in the catchment area. The next one, and I'm not going to discuss it because this goes into Lisa's area, is to approve the annual budget, the quarterly reports, the annual progress report, and the local business plan. I'll talk a little bit about the local business plan and all the finance stuff Lisa's going to cover. You have to appoint and evaluate an area director, and there's a very specific statute that tells you how to do that. You can borrow money with the approval of the local government commission. The way we have structured these bylaws, now that all of you have been appointed by the counties, this will be a self-appointing board moving forward. So the board will have a nominating committee, will solicit input from the county commissioner advisory board, so that we are ensuring the participation of the counties. But moving forward, the nominating committee will recommend appointments for vacant seats, and this board will vote on them.
There is one more that's not on there, that no sitting CFO who is now CFO may retire for the next 4 years.
I will put that in the bylaws right now.
That was left out somehow.
Yes, I will do that.
Okay, thank you.
You develop and approve the bylaws and the board policies. And this is kind of a new one that was not in your bylaws before, but is really important from a healthcare perspective, and Carolyn could probably give some insight on this as well. But it is very important from the perspective of OIG that at a healthcare company like we are, that the board has ultimate authority to oversee the compliance program. So I'm going to talk about compliance later after Lisa. Your other big function is you have to have meetings. So please make sure you have your meetings. The board appointment, we'll talk about, So the board appointment is 21 members. We talked about this. You have to reside in the catchment area. You can't be a lobbyist. You can't be a state employee. You cannot be an elected state official. Providers who receive funding from the LME, MCO may only serve in an ex officio non-voting capacity. We have to ensure county participation. We have 8 at-large members, and the remaining members are categorical appointments. I was going to have you kind of go through the bylaws, but I think we'll skip that because we'll run out of time. The appointment categories, and let's see if everybody knows what category they fall in. Who is our current county commissioner?
Mr. Lavender.
Very good. We have 3 CFAC members. Who is this is a tricky one. So who's the chair of the CFAC this year?
All 3.
The actual chair, now, the designee of the CFAC is Judy. Judy fills that particular slot. The family member is Nancy. And then the statute also asks for a, quote, openly declared consumer, and that is Pat. So everybody has a category. We have to have someone with healthcare expertise and experience in MHIDDSA services. Is that Maggie? I believe that it is. Very good. Healthcare administration expertise consistent with the scale and nature of the MCO.
Joyce?
It's now up to pick.
Dr. Heck.
Dr. Hex, very good. Financial expertise consistent with scale and nature of the MCO. Where is he? That would be our chair, Mr. French. Insurance expertise, that's going to be the really tough one for us to find. That's vacant. Social services expertise.
Joyce.
That's Joyce. A licensed North Carolina attorney with healthcare experience. That's Carolyn. A member of the general public appointed by the secretary. Very good, Judy. It's Ed. President of our Provider Advisory Council. Duncan. Hospital administrator in an ex officio capacity. That is Casey Cooper, who's not with us today. So those are all the categories. So if I didn't call you out, you are one of the 8 at-large members. All right, so you have to have a local business plan, and I mentioned this before, but it talks about how services will be provided. The statute says it has to address access, availability of providers, consumer choice, fair competition. It also must have input from the CFAC. That is a requirement of the statute. Then we also have appointment of the CEO or area director. I didn't run this slide by Brian first, but Nancy said it was okay.
Could we go back to that other one for just a second?
Sure.
Is there anything in that local business plan, that statute, that is not covered somewhere else in statute? For example, if that local business plan were to be eliminated tomorrow, would there be something that wouldn't happen in an LME MCO?
No. It is duplicative of other requirements in Chapter 122C.
That's what I'm heard.
So,
What it would do would be to save a lot of our time.
That's what I'm heard.
yes. Because it has to be approved by each county. And that is it's very time consuming.
But I mean, in other words, the access, the consumer choice, all of that is covered somewhere else.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes,
By statute.
by statute.
Well, all of those things, by and large, are good part of our contracts.
Yep.
I mean, that the waiver is very concerned with all of those things.
Yep. So your other function is you have to appoint our CEO, area director. The statute says that this person must have a master's degree in management experience. As you know, Mr. Ingram serves at the pleasure of the board. The statute has what I also call, and Lemire will know this, the Charlie Franklin rule. Does everybody know what the Charlie Franklin rule is? Does everybody know who Charlie Franklin is? If you don't know who Charlie Franklin is, raise your hand. Oh, wow, I get to tell a story. Okay, so Charlie Franklin was the area director of Albemarle Elementary. Charlie Franklin currently he is drawing down the largest pension in all of the state of North Carolina. It is bigger than, oh boy, this is going to be terrible because I'm so bad at sports. But who is our big basketball coach at UNC? Roy?
Williams.
Dean
Dean Smith. He is pulling down a larger pension than Dean Smith. which apparently shocks a lot of people.
How much is it?
I don't know what the amount is off the top of my head. But people call it at the legislature the Charlie Franklin Rule. And what it is a piece of the statute that says if the area director's salary is going to go outside of the range that's in the state personnel salary plan, it has to be approved by the state personnel director. And the reason for that is because Albemarle just kept approving these enormous salaries for him. And not just for him, for his secretary also. His secretary was making more than the governor of North Carolina. See, I love that story. So anyway, that's the Charlie Franklin Rule, and that's what I call it. And that's also why the area director has to have the same benefits as the LME employees. There is one exception for severance and relocation for recruitment purposes. But you cannot say that the area director, for example, can have a car or an apartment or special leave that is not available to the LME employees, because those were other perks that the area director in Albemarle was getting. We have to have you can have a contract though because of the severance and the relocation piece. And you do have to do an annual evaluation. It's required by the statute, and I believe Nancy walks y'all through that every year. Judy?
Could you please read the cartoon fonts?
I am so sorry. Cartoon says, the board is very disappointed in your performance as CEO. The employees aren't even sending you hate mail anymore. Okay, so moving on from the area director, kind of a natural segue into human resources. One thing to keep in mind is that at Smoky, the employees are subject to the State Human Resources Act, what we used to call the State Personnel Act. I believe that's the case at all the other MCOs except for Cardinal. I think Cardinal has exempted themselves somehow. Employees are prohibited from providing services which require resources or facilities of the LME. Employees are not allowed to accept dual compensation without written permission from the LME. And our personnel records, this is a funny one, our personnel records are confidential except for all of those things, which basically means they're not confidential. And we do participate in the local government retirement system. So these are the primary LME functions that we at the LME at the staff level do and you oversee. We have the, comprehensive planning, budgeting, and monitoring, the financial management and accountability. Okay, so the financial piece is all about, these are public dollars. We have to ensure a high-quality provider network, and this includes in the statute monitoring, technical assistance, capacity development, and quality control, utilization management, and that's about determining the appropriate level and intensity of services using medical necessity and coverage criteria. We determine eligibility for the innovations waiver and the registry of unmet needs. We do care coordination. We have community collaboration, public relations, community advocacy, and consumer affairs responsibilities. These are all in the statute. It's interesting because that, to me, is the piece that separates us from, in a lot of ways, from private companies. This is what's in the statute that is specific to LMEs. And the statute says that we have to have a process to protect consumer rights, an appeals process, and support of an effective CFAC. We have to run a 24/7 call center, and that is for crisis response, and it's considered the portal of entry into care.
Let me just put you on the spot here, Lanier, as if you can speak to the General Assembly about it. There's so much discussion, initially about kind of going away from the public model to a commercial model. Do you think people appreciate the differences in what those models would be?
I think that the greatest majority of the general assembly have no idea what our model is or what the differences would be. If we keep in mind, like, over half of the legislature has got now 3 years or less experience, and I could probably count on two LCMs, those who have any substantial knowledge about health and human services issues in either chamber. So you've got a lot of well-meaning folks who have very little history. And so if you said, how would you say what the difference is? First of all, I don't think they could describe, for the most part, what we do. We've got a couple Nelson dollars, this, two of those that's been involved years. Beyond that, they can describe what we do or how we do it, or how we differ. So that's a long answer to that.
Well, and another answer, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I mean, if you've been sitting and watching the presentation yesterday, I mean, I think you could not come away from that without the impression that what you do is at great breadth and depth, very rich and robust. And you're simply not going to get that level of community involvement and that breadth of community concerns from a commercial company. And there's a second gigantic difference, and that is that commercial companies operate on the process and a public sector managed care company does not. It operates on the principle of person-centeredness, consumer-centeredness, and reinvestment back. Gigantic difference, and that's lost on most people across the board, non-government.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, first of all, under the statute, we can't be profit. I mean, have big profits. But the second thing is I've traveled around a number of states in the last year or two, and consulting work I'm doing, and talk to states and providers in the behavioral health arena that are trying to build bigger commercial companies, and it's a different world. So,
Another problem, one of the things we're doing, the County Commissioner Association is taking, now they are organized and they have their own, is all the former county commissioners who are in the legislature now have where they can meet under the ethics rule. And so we're bringing in session once a month, we have a breakfast. And we're bringing in some of the, you got to also not only what we were said about the new ones, but 82% have never held a public office, of the new ones. So we're bringing those folks in to those meetings and talking about some of the things like this, but there's so much on their plate, you wonder when they're, if it just don't. But that's some of the things we're, to educate not only on the mental health side, but this is more, as far as the Medicaid waiver, Lanier can tell you, there's nobody left that started, are there anybody left that started the Medicaid waiver? Anybody?
no, probably not.
Nobody.
I don't know about, yeah, probably not.
Probably not of any significance.
No.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, there's some functions in 122C that really separate us from private managed care, and I think that's kind of the thing to remember about our LME functions. We also have to do reporting and policies, procedures, general administration. I am not going to go through all of this, and I am not the reporting guru. Christina or Julie would have to do that, but I think just suffice it to say, we do a lot of reports. Sometimes it seems like that is all we do is generate reports for DMA and DMH.
Just say this, like, if you've ever been involved in a conversation where, there seems to be this popular misconception that there's no accountability for us with what we do as a managed care company, just reference that slide.
Yes. And this isn't even all of them. You see I put the word sample at the top. This is just a sample of our reporting requirements, because the list of our reporting requirements is like this long and it wouldn't fit on slides.
And Smokey probably does this better than anybody.
I think Smokey does an excellent job. One of the things that we are doing differently with this board that Brian recommended and we put into the bylaws is we created a new committee. It's called the Performance and Quality Committee, and it's going to review those reports so that we're making sure that the board is really understanding what those reporting requirements are and what our performance measures look like.
It's so extensive, we talked about this in the executive committee. on the one hand, there's just so much of it. And it's not like the first time you sit down with a report, you're going to get it all. So that it was just too difficult to deal with that, you know, in our large board setting. Couldn't even really deal with it at the executive committee. So the idea is to have a committee devoted to exactly that. And over time, they'll develop the expertise and understanding of this. They'll create more accountability for us. So I think it's a great, you know, thing about that.
And I
Carl
believe
Glass
Duncan,
is going to be our guy for that.
yeah, Carl Klassen and Duncan, I think you're on that committee. I believe we have 2 CFAC members on that committee. We really think this is going to be an important committee for us moving forward. It's going to be quarterly. And Dr. Heck, I think you're on that committee. Yeah.
And I had a question about that, is that are the performance and quality dashboards populated with requirements by the statute, or
Contracts.
is there some flexibility?
For the most part, they're populated from things from our contracts with DMA and DMH. There are some things in the statute as well, though. And some of it is outdated. Like, I think there's a lot of opinion that all this stuff, I put client data warehouse up there. It is an immense amount of work for client data warehouse, and I'm not sure that there's agreement that the CDW reporting is really necessary anymore.
So is there any local flexibility about what's in there, or?
Some of the templates really, or the methodologies for creating the reports are dictated by the state. And I don't know, you know, we can report on anything we want. Okay?
I guess
we don't do it just because the state makes us do it.
Right, I mean, one of the reasons for asking is, are any of those measures like integrated into ACO measures and all the kind of the parallel movement that you see in health and human services that are coming down? Like, I mean, I would see that LV would play a vital role in helping to provide some of that data.
Yeah, absolutely. It includes measures on integrated care. It includes measures on length of stay and inpatient units. It includes a lot of different measures. I am just really not the expert in that, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to kind of move forward. But we are going to have this committee, and you guys will have the opportunity to really delve into those reports. And we can get you if anybody ever wants to see a list of the reports that we do, Julie can provide that, no problem. So I'm going to go through these really quick. These are kind of outdated pieces in the statute, but they're still there, and they still have the force and effect of law, so I feel like I need to tell you about them. DHHS can take various actions against us as an LME MCO if we fail to provide minimally adequate services to persons in need in a timely manner. They can withhold funding, and they can contract out for the services that we do. They can divest us of powers. We have to have notice and the opportunity to be heard and given the ability to implement a corrective action plan. They can remove a specific function if we don't meet the reporting requirements of a specific function. They have to give us 3 months of technical assistance first. Serious financial mismanagement, they can consult with the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Health and Human Services. The only time I'm aware of that happening, I think, was with Southeastern. Is that ringing a bell, Christina? There was one LME in the last 10 years that was just, it's not that they were necessarily doing a bad job service-wise, it was just financially their books were a mess and nobody could figure out, you know, were they in the red, were they in the black, no one knew. But the real one that matters right now is this Senate Bill 208 that we already talked about. Okay, so we're going to shift gears one more time and talk about Medicaid, everything you always wanted to know but were too afraid to ask. I always start with this quote. I've used this quote for a number of years. It's one of my very favorite quotes from a federal judge of all time. He said, "The Medicaid statute, as is true of other parts of the Social Security Act, is an aggravated assault on the English language, resistant to attempts to understand it. The statute is complicated and murky, not only difficult to administer and to interpret, but a poor example to those who would like to use plain and simple expressions. Truer words have never been put to paper." Has anybody ever tried to read the Medicaid Act? I have. Anybody read the Affordable Care Act? Carolyn and I have read the Affordable Care Act. When it first came out, you got to do a lot of fun because the Affordable Care Act said things like this. Strike paragraph A34B from page 297 of Title 18 of the Social Security Act. And then you'd have to go back to the Social Security Act and try to figure out what were they striking. So it was a lot of fun when it first came out. So the Social Security Act, you know, we talk about it all the time. We talk about Social Security. I think a lot of people don't really understand what it's all about. It has a bunch of different titles. So we talk about different titles in the Social Security Act, kind of like different titles in the Civil Rights Act. The ones that you all are probably most familiar with, Title II is what we think of as regular Social Security. So your retirement pension is in Title II. Social Security disability income for people who have earned a minimum number of work credits is in Title II. Title IV is what we now call TANF and what used to be aid to families with dependent children. Title 16 is supplemental security income for the disabled. These are for people who have not earned enough work credits to qualify under Title II. Title 18 is Medicare. Title 19 is Medicaid. So that's the one I'm most familiar with. And Title 21 is the state CHIP program, which in North Carolina is called North Carolina Health Choice. So the basics of Medicaid that I want you to come away with. So it was created by the Social Security Amendments of 1965. It is the largest payer of mental health and substance abuse services in the United States. When you look at private insurance, for the most part, they cover two things, inpatient and outpatient. Okay? We cover all the other stuff, things that actually make a difference in people's lives. Eligibility is both categorical and means tested. So for example, you can't just be a single man who is poor to get Medicaid unless you fall into a category. And that category would be either you would have to be disabled. The other category is pregnant women. Parents of children under 5, I think, is one of the categories, and the theory that you want to keep those parents healthy so they can take care of those children under 5. Children are another category, and then it's means tested on income and assets. It's interesting though because the theory behind Medicaid expansion was that it was going to take away that whole categorical distinction, and it was just going to extend it to everybody up to 138% of the poverty level. The statute says 133, but then it has a 5% set aside, so that's why it's really 138. And I was really excited about that because I felt like it was going to grab this whole segment of the population that I think of in my mind as young male substance abusers who can never get any services because they can never qualify because they're not sick enough to be disabled yet. And so they can't get Medicaid through that way, they don't have private insurance, and they fall through the cracks. We have to have a state plan. The state plan I think of as the contract between the federal government and the state for how you're going to run your Medicaid program and what services you're going to include in it, because this is something a lot of people don't realize. Medicaid has a very, very tiny list of required services. Very tiny. Mental health is not in it. Most of the services you think of are not in it. Inpatient services are in it. Some physical health services are in it. But the required services are very short. It's the optional services that you put into your state plan and decide which optional services you're going to cover. And it's overseen at the federal level by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We talk about CMS all the time, and that is CMS.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that from a budget standpoint, the optional services are just under half. But they include pharmacy, they include mental health, they include some of the long-term care. Skilled nursing is in the required, but assisted living, home health, and all that's in the optional. And that the optional services, as long as I've been involved since the mid-90s, every year the legislature looks, well, we got too rich a program, we need to get rid of some optional services. When you take pharmacy, mental health, and long-term care, that's something like 92, 93% of the optional services. And we're not likely to change any of those significantly. And so then you got chiropractic about some therapies and things like that, but you can eliminate all, I looked at that once, you eliminate all of those and you've taken maybe 1 or 2 years growth out of the program and you're back to where you were.
I
And
feel like
politically, over 20 years I've been involved, with only 2 times that the legislature has actually passed legislation that I can remember to reduce or eliminate service. 1, they eliminated Viagra, and 2, they eliminated voluntary circumcision.
I feel like we went through this in the personal care services litigation because that was one of the issues was why don't you just eliminate it as an optional service? And it just, you can't, it's almost impossible to eliminate them. So essentially Medicaid is the nation's primary source of health insurance coverage for low-income people. Each state administers it differently, so eligibility is different state by state. You can establish different eligibility criteria depending upon what your state plan says within the ranges that are allowed. CMS, one thing to keep in mind, because we talk about this a lot, CMS, the offices that we deal with, CMS has a regional office in Atlanta, and then there is the main office in Baltimore. Michael?
Where, on that, where would we stand when you stack us up against the other states in terms of those options?
We are generous. North Carolina is a generous state, a very generous state.
But most expansions of the program over the years try to deal with a particular issue, or, and this is probably the more frequent reason, to try to draw down federal dollars and help pay for something rather than state.
It's the use of Medicaid as a verb.
All right. Yep. I gotta keep moving. This is one I like to ask people because we talk about the waiver all the time. The waiver is what we do. Can anyone in this room tell me what the combined BC waiver is? All right, Brian, no. This is why it's called a waiver, because you have the Social Security Act that has very specific requirements for the Medicaid program. The waiver, in that waiver, CMS has waived certain of those requirements. Okay, and it allows North Carolina to operate Medicaid and specifically behavioral health in a different way. We are one of only 3 states with a combination BC waiver. One of the advantages, as we talked about, is that expenditures can be more accurately budgeted and managed. The goal is to contain costs through capitation and improve quality through network management and some of the other quality measures we talked about. More than 65% of the total U.S. population is now served through some type of managed care arrangement, and that is probably an outdated statistic. It's probably gone up. I think that's from maybe 2011. So what's the 1915B part? This is interesting. This is what's called a delivery system waiver. So the B part is what lets us do it on a managed care basis versus a fee-for-service basis. And it waives statewide-ness. It says you can implement this in a specific area of the state rather than the whole state. So for example, when Piedmont started, it was, we're doing it this way in these 5 counties because normally Medicaid has to be the same regardless of where you live in the state. It waives comparability of services. You can provide different types of benefits to people enrolled in a managed care delivery system. And this is a big one. It waives freedom of choice. Because what the Medicaid statute says is that consumers have the right to services from any willing and qualified provider. You get into arguments about what qualified means, but any willing and qualified provider is the law. It waives that. And it says that states can require people to obtain their Medicaid services from a managed care plan that doesn't have to enroll every willing and qualified provider. So this is how we have the ability to limit and control our network. So the C part is the innovations waiver, what we used to call CAP-MRDD. And what it does, this is a home and community-based services waiver that allows the provision of long-term care services in home and community-based settings for people who meet ICF level of care criteria. It also allows some non-medical services to be provided, and that is a huge, huge thing because Social Security, the Medicaid Act, limits things to medical services. Under this waiver, we are able to deliver some non-medical services, and I'll talk about that very quickly. It has a limited number of slots, It also waives the deeming of income and resources. So when people are looking at eligibility, you're looking at the income of that person, not the income of that family. So ICF level of care criteria is what you have to meet. I don't have time really to go through that. The innovation services, because I think Dr. Haiku had some questions, so I added some of this. So here's one list. These are some of the basic services and innovations: assistive technology, equipment and supplies, crisis services, day supports, in-home skill building, in-home intensive, personal care, individual goods and services, residential supports, and respite. Respite is one of those things that cannot be provided for generally under Medicaid because it's not intended for the individual Medicaid beneficiary. Respite is intended for the caregiver. And then we have, here's a bunch of non-medical services. I think. This is where I'm not 100% because I am not the innovations expert. It's one of my goals this year. Community guide, community networking, community transition, financial support. This is a big one. Home modifications and vehicle adaptations. We can use Medicaid dollars to modify someone's bathroom so that they can stay living at home and not have to go into an institution. We can use Medicaid dollars to pay for vehicle adaptation so a family can have a lift to get a wheelchair ramp attached to their car. This is a huge, huge piece. Natural supports education. So this is education and training for the caregivers.
Are these set in regulations or are these per?
These are in the waiver.
Okay, so there's very specific.
It's very
about what-
specific, yes.
And how much you can
And
and
how much and the limits and all that and what the budget is.
the
And that is-
criteria for who gets it?
Yes.
Okay.
And all of that would take 2-3 hours of a training, and we can do that sometime if you guys would like, but we definitely don't have time to go into it today.
Let me re-ask your question in a different way. Are you saying that it allows those, or it says that you have to? The waiver. The
These
waiver
are
says
services that are allowed under the waiver,
allowed.
and you have to meet criteria, clinical coverage criteria for them.
Yeah, you can meet the criteria. If you meet the criteria, you're going to.
Yes. Yes. If you meet medical necessity and other coverage criteria, you're entitled to it. Up to a budget limit. There's a budget limit, I think it's $135,000 per person per year. Is that sounding right?
Yes.
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 This is a special smorgasbord option in the restaurant of smoking.
But who then controls when you say, yes, the waiver allows you to do all of those, but we're not going to do it? Does smoking control that, or the
Yes,
state?
and I'm going to talk about that after Lisa. I'm going to get back to due process and appeals and all that. So the next big piece really is, what we've been talking about, which is Medicaid managed care. It's governed by a very specific section of the Code of Federal Regulations that I carry around with me, and our DMA contract. This was a big shift for North Carolina behavioral health providers. Is that a fair statement, Duncan?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so some of our functions, we have some clinical managed care functions, which would be utilization management. Care coordination is a managed care function. Our provider network functions. The CFR has this very specific language that we have to maintain a network of providers that is sufficient in number, mix, and geographic distribution to meet the needs of the anticipated number of enrollees in our catchment area. And we do that through a gap needs analysis and a capacity study. And part of what the provider network department does is credentialing, and then contracting, performance monitoring, and then developing the network, building up the network so that we have the capacity that we need. Finance, boy, and this is where I don't know what I'm talking about, so please jump in. We do rate development. We're allowed to set our own rates with providers, with all providers except the ICF facilities. Claims processing, big, huge part of our managed care function. Medical loss control through analysis of encounter data. So that would be an example of that. I can tell you would be last week, Lisa said, since we've merged with Western Highlands, we've seen a huge spike in PRTF. So she's able to see that in the encounter data and communicate that to the clinical team so they can try and figure out why that's happening. Medical loss ratio is the proportion of PMPM that's spent on clinical services and quality improvement. And that's something that CMS is looking very closely at. They want to see that at a very high percentage rate. Quality and integrity, we have to have an ongoing quality assessment and performance improvement program. That's a requirement of the regulations. We do that through performance measures, our grievance and complaint monitoring, and program integrity, the fraud, waste, and abuse piece.
I mean, y'all have a mandated MLR or?
We do not.
Okay.
We do not. And note that community collaboration is not listed as one of the managed care functions. And that's because it's not a managed care function, it is one of our LME functions. And that gets back to that distinction we were talking about between private managed care and public managed care. So all the wonderful stuff that Jenny and her team and all the people and Brian and everybody who works for Jenny would most likely go away in a private managed care system. So the insurance model that we're looking at is managed care, which is basically managed risk. And we have our PMPM. Does everybody know what PMPM stands for? Per member per month. And there's a lot of theories that bigger is better because then the risk is more widely distributed and shared. And I kind of skipped over a little bit on the fraud and abuse. I want to emphasize we don't think that all our providers are out there abusing the system and being fraudulent, but we have to have a very robust program integrity. Can anybody guess how many dollars were recovered in fiscal year 2012 by all of the state Medicaid fraud control units combined? Throw out a number. $3 billion were recovered. This is not identified. This is dollars that were actually recovered. Over 1,300 convictions and 800 settlements. So it's not something that we can pretend isn't happening and ignore. It's something that even the mafia has gotten in on. There's mafia Medicaid fraud, and the FBI is involved in that, and it's a major priority for CMS. An interesting quote, I think, from a report to Congress about Medicaid fraud, waste, and abuse, and they said, Medicaid providers in particular often seem to believe that creative billing is an appropriate response to inadequate Medicaid payment rates, that they are somehow equitably entitled to the amount they claim, whether or not their claims comply with the program rules. So that's kind of an interesting perspective because I think we can all agree that the rates are in large part insufficient.
Tracy, do you have a percentage of how much of that was behavioral health?
I don't, but I could probably get that for you.
It's not just one.
And did you say 2012?
Fiscal year 2012.
Okay, but I've got to dig it for the provider side because trying to understand the regulations.
Totally agree.
It is
Totally agree.
very difficult.
It is very difficult. And then last thing before I take a break is the transitions to community living. I'm sorry that Lanier stepped out actually because he and I kind of lived this for a while. So give you a little background of transitions to community living, which is our US DOJ settlement. Really the whole process started with the Olmstead decision in 1999, and there's a lot of confusion about what that decision actually said. It did not say that everybody gets to live in the community no matter what. It said that people should live in the community if the placement can be reasonably accommodated, taking into account the resources available to the state. But what's interesting is that the studies have shown that community placement is cheaper than institutionalization in the long term. In 2003, we had a major case in New York called Disability Advocates versus Patterson. It was exactly like the situation in North Carolina with adult care homes. In 2009, President Obama announced the Year of Community Living, and US DOJ began a number of investigations that year. Disability Rights filed their complaint July of 2010 about individuals with serious and persistent mental illness living in adult care homes without access to services and without any sort of community integration in violation of the ADA and Olmstead. And in August of 2012, a settlement agreement was reached between US DOJ and the state of North Carolina. after over a year of negotiations that I myself spent probably 2-3 days a week for a whole year doing nothing but this case. The purpose of the settlement is to assure that persons with mental illness are allowed to reside in their communities in the least restrictive settings of their choice. Our functions with respect to the settlement is interesting. The state entered into the settlement, but the state really doesn't do a whole lot with it. They signed the document, and then they called a meeting with the LMEs and said, look what we've done. Aren't you excited? Look at all the work you're going to get. And then we all said, well, how are we going to get paid for it? And that took some doing. But the things that we do are in reach, and the priority right now is for individuals living in adult care homes, diversion to keep people out of adult care homes, and transition. And that's about the housing slots, the rental assistance, ensuring a high fidelity ACT model, and beefing up our supported employment. Smoky is exceeding our state targets, and thought I'd end here with a little positive news. We were in the Winston-Salem Journal in January. We identified 356 individuals who may qualify for the transition. We've already been in touch with 313 of them. This was as of January 26th, so I'm sure those numbers are a little higher now. We placed 32 into an individual home setting, so 32 individuals who have been living in an institution for, what, Christina? Some of them many years. Are living on their own in the community for the first time in a very long time. Another 61 are in the planning process, and then we have a nice quote from Brian, and so this was really nice to have that really positive publicity. We got extremely good feedback from the state about this. They were thrilled with this news report because the reviewer for the US DOJ settlement, there's a federal reviewer who has to make sure we're complying with it, happened to be in the state when this news report came out, so the state was really thrilled with that. All right, I'm going to take a break now. I think y'all probably want to take a break. We're going to have to make it a 5-minute break, and then Lisa's up.
We check out now.
Is it possible to get that email to us?
Yes.
Jill? Yes.
That was excellent.
I'm not done yet.